Hey everybody, you're tuning into Dr. Berst from Auckland, New Zealand, and on this month's episode of the Avondale Pavilion project, we have an interview featuring myself. It's going to be a little bit of a monologue, but I'm going to unpack a little bit of my story and tell you guys a little bit about my journey in kind of graph writing. So I'm going to dive straight into it. So originally I was born in Hong Kong, moved to New Zealand when I was 3 years old. And, you know, really when we came from Hong Kong, we were really searching for a better life here in Aotearoa. I've always had a really modest upbringing in terms of having support from my family, but definitely when I got to high school, I went to Auckland Boys Grammar, and that was just like a school that I don't feel like I ever really fit in. It was an all-boys school, you know, super formal, very strict, but I was really disconnected, I think, with the whole educational system, and I wasn't good at anything related to sports or academia and even art actually at the time either. So not long after, when I was about 16 years old, when I look back at it now, I was pretty young. Yeah, I basically dropped out and ended up, you know, just going to house parties and, you know, didn't really have any real direction or passion in life at that time. And until I guess I discovered graffiti. And that was really through a lot of my friends that I went to school with. And, you know, given that it was an all-boys school, there was a lot of kind of masculinity, I guess, you know, within the kind of culture of the school. And one of the things that everybody did was they did roll calls. And it was basically, you know, very iconic thing to do in New Zealand, where they were basically doing straights. And I'd always see them at the backs of all the other students' books. And I didn't really know why they were doing that, but everybody essentially had a tag name. At first, I was really kind of quite against it because I didn't really understand what this whole kind of culture was about, but I definitely knew that there was a kind of naughty or rebellious kind of attitude to it, or something about it that made it kind of look quite badass when I first kind of saw it. So not long after, and kind of, I guess, having a limited awareness of really what it was, I started to develop an understanding and seeing people do it all the time, and I actually started doing it. I caught the bug. I can't remember what came first, but I remember tagging up I think it was the geography block or something like that, tagging on the desk, and I got in trouble, got sent to the, you know, deputy headmaster's or deputy principal's kind of office, and then I think I got suspended for doing that, because I like tagged up the place. And then also I remember tagging up the toilets at some point and stupidly kind of admitting to that, even though I had just done it with like a whiteboard marker and it could have been wiped off. I remember getting, you know, suspended for doing something like that. And so that first instance of being suspended, like, it was quite an unusual one, because it really made me feel like a little bit of an outcast and just, you know, being kind of kicked out of school. And then at that time as well, I also got in trouble for fighting with some other guy, and like it was all a bit of a kind of weird period of time, I think, in my life as a teenager. I do recall that, you know, in the first instance of me tagging and really going out there, it was quite a scary moment, to be honest, because I bombed up one of the main kind of bus routes which leads people to school. And I remember on one school night kind of tagging up everything, and just the next morning there were a lot of people that were at school going, "Who's this Berst guy?" And I recall just kind of like swooping and being like, "Oh, that's me," and then nobody really believed me. But that was probably my first real taste of fame and kind of notoriety at that time. And so that kind of led me on to then discover things like the internet forums, which were places like the Hip Hop NZ. That was a really popular one, 12 ounce profit. And also at that time, some of our friends had like graph DVDs and things like that. But I would say that the main vehicle was really starting to see all of the things that were happening online through this particular forum called Hip Hop NZ, which was, they had a particular section which was like focused on graffiti, and people would basically upload all of the pictures and all the things happening. I don't know if it was the real writers that were kind of uploading that stuff, or people just kind of sharing in the community, but that was giving me kind of an insight of what was kind of happening around the place, because I was obviously still stuck in my kind of suburb, which was in central Auckland. And, you know, I hadn't really ventured out any further to see what was out there. So having this internet kind of platform really gave me a little bit of exposure to see what was kind of happening. And that's really how I met people like Dest, Seen As, and Admit. Those were probably three of the kind of main people. And eventually I got invited to join AK, which stood for Aerosol Kings. And eventually, after doing a little bit of bombing together collectively as a crew, and there was only like a couple of us, we met up with another crew which is called GB, and those were the likes of, Talk, Hazard, and Hero. And from there, we formed like a bit of a partnership actually. And in the first instance, I remember that the moment that we kind of linked up, we weren't initially known as GBAK. We were still AK and GB, two separate crews, but from that we formed like a really good friendship and a motivation to really get up collectively, with those two crews. And one of the major sparks was probably when we had first painted our first production together, which was based in Te Aratu on the local fish and chip shop. And from there everybody painted a piece. And these pieces are like super small, but it was the first time that we were working together. It was probably like my second or third piece or something, potentially. I'm not sure, but everything that I painted at that time was like pretty horrible. I was still discovering how to even use the spray can. At the end, we were doing this thing where we had put up the crew and the kind of like block letter type font. It was like an AKGB, and we're like, oh, AKGB, that sounds a little bit weird. Let's kind of flip it around and GBAK, that kind of works. There's a little, it kind of rolls off the tongue a lot better than AKGB. So we're like, okay, let's stick with GBAK. And to kind of keep in mind as well that at this time, all of us were like super young. We were, didn't really know the rules. So there was a lot of things that we were all kind of learning about graffiti at the same time. But we knew that we were all interested in graffiti and really super keen to get up. And I would say that one of the major kind of thresholds for us, to cross was really learning those rules and, watching things like DVDs of graffiti, which were predominantly coming from New York. I remember one night we were watching the Cope 2 Kings Destroy DVD, and that being quite influential to quite a lot of people in the crew, because that really shaped and formed a lot of kind of attitudes. The New York, I guess, way of thinking, about capping people and beef and potentially style as well, because at that time, everything that was painted in there, we saw that as pretty next level stuff in terms of the pieces and things. So we took a lot of that attitude as kind of young teens and kind of brought that to the street. But I guess as part of that unspoken rule of learning, how the kind of underground graffiti world works, was really also things like racking your paint, and we did a lot of that as a crew. And I remember going out on missions just in the weekend, and that would be like the thing to do, because at that time you don't really have money, so you're not able to go out there to go purchase all of this paint and things like that. So racking was definitely part of that kind of culture at that period of time. There's lots of stories there, but one of the main things I think about GBAK when we kind of initially connected was it was really about our ability to connect through different regions, I guess, of Auckland in terms of like east, west, and central. We didn't really have anybody coming from out south, but we were able to connect with these kind of different suburbs, and so each person living in these different areas kind of had knowledge of the track sides and all the local spots that people would paint, and so that was a really awesome thing, because the moment we had that connection to different people from different suburbs, it really felt like we could link up and go paint these kind of regular graffiti spots. And for me, that was quite important, because that was our first real introduction to a very exclusive underground kind of public gallery, and there were places that were treated like halls of fame, such as Combat Zone, places in Newmarket or Central Auckland that, I first experienced quite young during my teenage years, but then I started really growing that appreciation of seeing all of the burners and the pieces and things, popping up in other places as well. And I think what graffiti probably led us to collectively as a crew was also this, because everything was new to us, all the things that you would see, on running along the train lines, and then the freights and all of these abandoned buildings and things that you would never experience or see as a normal person, just living your day-to-day life. So there was definitely a very special world that you got insight to by doing graffiti, because it made you curious about your city and you wanted to explore it, basically, so and that was something that was quite exciting for me, because I almost felt like I was a bit of an urban explorer in some way, being able to experience all of these places which are often off limits for most people, so that was definitely a really exciting time because everything was very new. And I would say that when we kind of first started as well, there was obviously many generations of writers which had already come before us, the likes of RFC, RTR, TMD, and I remember that during this period of time attending some of these events called the Hip Hop Summit. And so for the people that don't know what that is, that was really during the early 2000s. There was a very big event called the Hip Hop Summit, which really encapsulated the culture of graffiti, MCing, DJing, breakdancing, and things like that. And that was held in Aotea Square. And that also was an opportunity where that was also an instance where international graffiti artists were coming over. So we were really able to see the level of quality that was happening overseas and internationally, and being able to see that firsthand. That was really incredible. So even during that kind of period of time, the likes of Askew and Fat One and TMD, all of them showed us a lot of love, even though we were like super toy and kind of had just been in the game for a couple of years. And when I say couple years, I literally mean like maybe 4 or 5 years or something like that. We were all still kind of bombing and just like probably on the cusp of like starting to piece and do more elaborate pieces of work and things, but we were still probably classed as toys as per most people would view. And I think we got a lot of beef from that. A lot of people would think that we're toy because we'd go over other people's stuff, or we're tagging the background, doing I guess kind of pretty typical toy stuff. But of course that's also some of the rules and things that we didn't really know. We just thought, tagging someone's background, we're not capping their piece, we can get fame in the background. But that was kind of our attitudes at the time. And also with that was perhaps egos of other crews that were kind of coming up at the same time, or started before us, and we're kind of the new dogs in the yard or something like that. We stuck together as a crew, kept putting in the work and stuff. But during this time as well of getting up, that's probably the time where we got into most trouble, meaning with the law, because the stuff that we were doing at that time was definitely a lot more stuff on the street, and all of us were like just so active and super busy and often doing lots of dumb things. Half the time you'd be drunk, not all the time, but just making really miscalculated kind of decisions, doing things that weren't necessary. And even at that time, I don't think that the police really took graffiti as all that seriously, really, as a major crime, because you would really just get charged for something like willful damage, which at the time I think is really a kind of slap on the wrist. In terms of like pushing it forward as a crew, when I think back, one of the major kind of accomplishments that I think we have achieved as a crew, and what we're probably recognized as the most, is probably the rollers that we did. And the rollers that we did were mostly floating rollers, and the motivation for that was that with a lot of the trackside spots kind of around Auckland, a lot of the history and things would be up on the top, and things at the bottom would always get capped, and there was always a regular turnaround of a lot of that work. And so our intention was really to have some of these rollers which would stay up on the trackside, floating, large scale, visible from the tracks, and those letters would read GBAK. We in many instances we would try to up the level and quality of the rollers by bringing more than just two colors. And I remember doing one in one of the track spots, and we had done like a full color piece basically with a roller, and with the roller did the background outline, or everything, really tried to step that up. And then probably one really other notable roller that we did, which took us a couple of nights, was running along the pipeline along Mission Bay. And that, I think to date, at that time, that was definitely one of the biggest roller pieces. I can't quite remember the full length of it, but it was definitely 100 something meters long. That really put us on the map, and I think some of the riders started to respect us a little bit more because they knew that we were a bit more serious about what we're doing and we're not just the toys. So amongst kind of doing the roller stuff, working as a crew and kind of getting up, there was also my personal focus, which was really about improving my style, because as much as I loved the kind of getting up aspect and the fame and everything, I definitely wanted to become really good at my craft. And I didn't really have a mentor or anything at that time, but definitely I would say that a notable person that I think I vibed with stylistically was probably somebody like Hazza. And we've been really good painting buddies for well over a decade now. As well as getting the kind of perspectives of New York, we were heavily influenced by a lot of West Coast graffiti, particularly MSK, and the likes of Revoke, Rhyme, Saber. All of those guys have been, played a significant role in kind of shaping that early direction of our graffiti. At that time as well, when I was, probably my most active, at least the beginning of my career, had just enrolled into art school. So this is obviously, a little bit after my time studying at high school. I enrolled into this degree, which was really focused on visual arts. And while I was, half in doing the study, I was like super focused on doing all of this graffiti. I think graffiti really in many ways kind of took control of my life, and it's probably the first thing that in my life where I've really gone hard at something, stuck to it, haven't given up, and really tried to improve, had a goal which I had never really had previously for anything. I guess this direction and energy that I've kind of given to graffiti compared to what was really happening in reality with the rest of my life, like things like my relationships with people, that probably went to the wayside, and not really caring about anything else other than doing graffiti. So I guess you could see it as a bit of an addiction, but also very difficult for me to try to find that balance between what I was doing with graffiti and everything else. While I was active painting graffiti, day in, day out, and going super hard with that, I think one of the things that kind of started to creep in was the recognition and respect, I guess, from some of the peers within the culture. And so, like I said, the likes of Askew and Fat One and these people that have been in the game for a long time, and people that I've idolized, since I first started painting, started getting respect from them, started entering graffiti battles and working together as a crew. And there was events like Kings of Style, and so when there were events like that, it really kind of gave me the energy and motivation to try to do better. And those became really important platforms for me to step my game up and be able to know that there were other kind of mediums of graffiti for me to kind of express myself beyond just painting a piece on the tracks, which might get capped the next day. There were things out there that I knew that I guess gave legitimacy to some of the stuff that we were doing. And so being able to paint alongside in a battle with other people, that's already a privilege in itself, because graffiti is not a very rewarding thing in the sense that it gives you money when you kind of first start off, but definitely you can definitely make money from graffiti and all the skill sets that you get from it. But in terms of like going out there, day in, day out and painting, on the tracks or something, that's not going to pay the bills, and you're not going to make a living like that. But being aware that there were other opportunities beyond this, that was really awesome to know, and be able to link up with other people, So that recognition and respect also led to a great relationship and partnership with Askew. He really vouched for me in the mid kind of 2000s, like 2010 I think, or 2009. And that really enabled me to partner with a paint company called Ironlac. And for the better part of 10 years they've been my paint sponsor, and that really switched the gears for me, because that really gave me an opportunity and access to all of these possibilities which I previously didn't have. Paint before was really expensive, I didn't have any money, and we only had crap quality paint to use. And so to have access to all of this good paint and a really large amount of it really pushed me to do something, really pushed me to improve the quality of what I was doing. And so on this kind of trajectory as well, I also found myself, finding a new way, venturing out beyond Auckland. And there were really early instances in the 2000s where I went over to Australia. I mean, most of it was like for parties and New Year's and things like that. I typically went to the Gold Coast and Brisbane. I recall that one of the first writers that we painted with was this guy called Kess, which was actually, I think at the time, had just been inducted into FX Crew from New York. And this guy is like super good. And when I look back at some of his stuff, it's still super burner. He was already doing like crazy wild style stuff, and I think this was like 2006 maybe, and I'm still doing like mad piles of pieces. I probably could barely put a piece together, but he was like a super dope writer, really gave us great hospitality. You know, I'm really actually quite surprised that he was willing to link up with some kids, you know, like one of our writers probably would have been 17 or something, so it would have been super young for this dude and to link up with us, and he was probably already in his late 20s, maybe even 30s. At that time as well, I recall going along the train lines along, you know, from Brisbane and seeing massive WTCS rollers, DTS pieces, and I mean, that stuff really blew my mind because I felt like a lot of that stuff was on a really high level in terms of the quality. During some of those visits there as well, I also managed to link up with some other writers, people like Slaw, Mame, Tells, Tabs, and also at that time as well, one of our crewmates, Dribs, had also moved over to Australia. So from there, he was one of the really early members to move overseas and form, you know, a bit of an Australian connection and started branching out. So that was quite interesting, and I would say that one of the main trajectories that kind of led me to a different chapter beyond GBAK was probably in around 2008 or 2009 potentially, when I was invited by Fat One to join TMD. And I still remember that moment because he had called me up, and I don't even know how many times we had painted or hung out, but he had called me up and he was like, hey man, like, you know, we've spoken to the crew, are you keen to be down in TMD? And I was like, holy crap, like, is this really happening? Because all of these old school guys, you know, they've been in the game for like a decade or two or however long, and like, I'm just, you know, these guys are people that I look up to, and to have the opportunity to be put down, that's a very big mantle, you know, to and level to aspire to. So that gave me a lot of motivation and to do better and know that I could be part of something greater, which is beyond myself. And also at that kind of same time, that was when I had just finished studying art school. I had just finished studying art school, and I also then carried on, you know, with some postgraduate studies, which led me down the road of teaching art actually. And kind of corresponding with that kind of time frame, we also had the opportunity, our boy Snick, he kind of teed up a really good relationship with a property developer who gave us a studio space in the city, and we ended up calling it Netch Park. But basically we got this massive studio space which was also shared with Askew, Misery, Hazza, and two other artists, and Tim. We basically painted all of the walls which are in this car park, and this is like a 3-level car park, and so there's like massive amount of wall space for people to paint, and it basically turned into Auckland's Hall of Fame, where international writers would come over and paint, and you know, the likes of Revoke, Vans, Rhyme, all of these people would come over and left their mark on some of these spaces. And it was quite an important place, because that was also an opportunity for us to really flex and try to improve and create something to paint, you know, at scale. You know, that's something that I had never experienced before. So to try really push those boundaries, and during this time as well, it was a great opportunity to partner with Askew and collaborate with him more and link up with him. So he's definitely, in terms of that period of time, been a huge mentor and collaborator for me, which is what took us down the direction of Netch, which was really just trying to challenge the conventions of graffiti, break that kind of traditional process. You know, I was really at that time over the idea of having to do a 3-color fade and then a black outline and there's some bubbles in the background and that kind of generic kind of format. So I really just thought, there has to be a different way to challenge that and do something different, you know, because I'd seen it so often. And that's definitely a formula that works, and I still continue to do it. But I think also I think it's important to keep things fresh and just keep trying to do, something new and bring new aspects of visual culture into the language of graffiti. I think that's what keeps pushing it forward. And also at that time as well, there was a bit of a handover from Askew to me in terms of him stepping away from the kind of curation of graffiti events, for example. So earlier I mentioned, he did things like the Hip Hop Summit. With the Hip Hop Summit, Askew had invited a lot of international artists over, and those weren't battle formats, but one of the things that really kind of carried on was this thing called Kings of Style. And so there was a really good kind of partnership with the council where he kind of handed that over to me, and I got to organize some of the graffiti events alongside the council, and we still got to bring some international guests over, which was really good. So I recall that from that event, I think there was like 2 or 3 years of it, we had the opportunity to bring over the likes of Journey, Royd, Soffles, Kaput, and Fex, from different all different countries, and all of these guys, have also contributed to the visual language of graffiti here in New Zealand, and I think shaped it in some way. That was also a really awesome handover, because that's also something that I've continued on, and that's predominantly been out at Corbin's for the people that have seen some of the encounter videos, but really kind of taking on different responsibilities, I guess, as a writer. And rather than just painting graph and trying to get up, the motivation I think has, when I've come back to this space now that I've particularly finished studying, and teaching, I've come back with an entirely different lens on graffiti, and it's not really just about getting up these days. It's about trying to contribute to the scene, to build it up and support the next generation of writers coming through, because graffiti is a very, Rhyme said it before, a very young man's game, and I kind of agree with that, because I think as life kind of moves on and you get older, you start picking up different responsibilities. It's not that I'm losing interest in graffiti, but I think just the different things you're involved with, in life kind of takes you down different trajectories. Like, for example, I'm very interested in exploring graffiti in the context of art, as opposed to just getting up and more of a vandalistic kind of approach. And some people might see that as soft, but I see that as uncharted territory, at least within New Zealand. Not saying that people that haven't done graffiti and art before, but I think that there's a lot of potential to explore in this space. And so, and so energies just get redirected, and with what I'm trying to do as well with a lot of the videos, I'm trying to build educational resources that once again help that next generation. And so doing things like that for me is really important, and I think it has value and meaning, and hopefully that will inspire other writers in the future to go do things like that and capture things like the oral history, and the stories and perspectives that are often invisible, because I think that you can paint graph all you want, but if you're just kind of following that super hardcore kind of convention, things get painted out really quickly, and it's a lot of hard work just to get a flick, to put all that energy in and see it disappear so quickly. So hopefully some of these videos, have a life of its own, and maybe hopefully they are more appreciated, in another 10 years time. I don't know. So yeah, that's kind of like a little bit of a snapshot of one chapter of my story. Thank you very much for listening and tuning in. And the next artist that we've got is Fluoro, who's also part of TMD, and she will be our first female guest on this Avondale Pavilion project. So make sure you stay tuned and check out next month's project.